Peeking is probably the best Valorant example of easy to learn, hard to master. The basics of peeking techniques are something virtually everyone knows a bit about, but even players who are serious about the game often have a lot of misconceptions about what good peeking actually looks like. It probably goes without saying, but good peeking is vital. There's no technique that's more important in winning duels, and it's not uncommon for it to be the ultimate decider in winning or losing games. That's why in this video, I'll be going over everything you need to know, starting with some of the basics, then moving on to a step-by-step technique in order to know how to peek every angle, and finally finishing it up with some more advanced insights to take your peeks from good to great. And real quick before the video, if you're currently below Radiant and you're looking to not only improve your peaks, but also your peak rank, my team of Radiant coaches and I can help you with our 10-week premium coaching program that offers a 500 RR rank up guarantee or your money back. That's right. If you don't see results with our coaching, you don't pay. We have over a dozen Radiant coaches with VCT experience on teams like Ascend, EG, FaZe, Immortals, Disguised, Gen G, Xset, Giants, and more. To learn more and to see if we'd be a good fit, use the link in the description below to book a free 45-minute strategy call. Hurry, because we maxed out all the spots for a previous season and we've just opened up 60 more spots. Already, 42 spots have been taken, so there's only 18 left, so don't wait. First things first, let's touch up a bit on the types of peeks that exist. The most widely utilized peek is just a standard peek. The idea of a standard peek is that you want to first pre-aim a potential angle, then you peek, and before you even see anyone, you already stop so that if anyone is there holding the angle, you can click on their heads as quickly as possible. Second, a wide peek and its variations. The wide peek is a peek where your goal is to counter any potential players holding your angle by going past their crosshair placement and swinging further than you would with a standard peek. How wide you want to go is up to you, but it's important to realize that the wider you go, the more potential enemies you can expose yourself to, so there's a trade-off involved. Next, jiggle peeks. Jiggle peeks are primarily used to gain information on your enemy's position and not so much to kill them. You quote unquote jiggle or peek and unpeek around an angle really quickly, exposing only a small part of your body in order to spot any enemies without giving them a real opportunity to kill you. There's also a variation of the jiggle peek, namely the shoulder peek, where your goal is to still get information, but this time your goal is not to see your enemies, but only to make them see you and fire a shot. It should be noted though, the shoulder peek isn't used too often in Valorant because you can wallbang most walls, which hampers the shoulder peek's effectiveness. Instead, there's another safer, more effective way to get that same information, that being the jump peek. Jump peeks are where you briefly jump around an angle in a circular motion to spot your enemies while not making yourself an easy target. In case this is your first time hearing about it though, it is definitely the hardest one to execute mechanically. If you need to learn how to exactly perform each peek, I made a 46-minute video that covers every Valorant mechanic, so go check that out. Once you've learned what these peeks are and how to use these peeks, you then need to learn when to use those different types of peeks. That's because knowing how to execute a perfect wide swing won't help you much if you try to use it to peek an operator standing at the back of B site breeze. At that kind of range, the extra distance from the wide swing isn't going to result in a big crosshair adjustment. And to add on to that, the operator is going to be at a big advantage even before you decide what peek to go for due to angle advantage. Similarly, hitting your enemies with a flawless jiggle peek won't win you the rounds if you're doing it right behind a spammable box. So the biggest takeaway from these examples is that knowing when to use the different types of peeks is much more important than your actual mechanical ability to know how to execute all the different peeks. That is where the Ape method comes in. And no, it doesn't mean playing like a monkey. Rather, it's a step-by-step decision-making framework that helps you recognize what peek you should go for in each situation. If you watch a lot of my content, you might know the Ape method is something I also discussed in this older video. But don't worry, I'll try to go through it pretty quickly, and I've added a few new things that weren't there before. The first letter in the Ape method stands for assess. You first need to assess the type of angle you're about to peek, as the way you should approach the angle differs greatly depending on that. There are three main types of angles. First, there are common angles, also referred to as on angles by some other coaches. These are your standard angles, often around cover that people commonly like to play around. Second, you got off angles. Off angles are almost the opposite of common angles. They're positions without much cover, often out in the open, which makes the player vulnerable to utility, double peeks, and things like careful jump peeks. Then you might ask, why would anyone play such terrible angles? Because off angle positions are so bad, they're good. A good off angle works because you don't expect an enemy to be there. And since there are many agents with escape tools such as Chamber, Jet, and Reyna, the drawbacks of off angles can be largely eliminated. This makes off angles extremely powerful on agents with escape tools. Finally, there's something I like to call roulette angles. These are angles where you're forced to peek 2 likely enemy positions at once, meaning you have to gamble on which side you want to pre-aim your crosshair before you peek. These angles are actually quite common and are extremely hard to deal with without using any abilities. For example, think about entering hookah. If you go in without using any of your teammates' abilities, you are quite literally playing Russian roulette. Now, after assessing the type of angle we're peeking, the next step in the Ape method is to prepare for how you'll peek the angle. The first step of preparation is to imagine the angle you're about to peek from the point of view of an enemy holding it. It might sound a bit odd at first, but it's really important since how good your peek is depends entirely on how it looks from the perspective of the person you're peeking. So ask yourself, how might the enemy be holding this angle and what kind of peek would work best against them? For example, are you peeking someone who has a high probability of holding the angle closely? Then it's a good idea to use a really wide peek to run fast past their crosshair. Is there a chance you might be peeking an op around a common angle? Then maybe it's not a great idea to use a standard peek, but instead you can jump peek to safely gain info and even bait out a shot. Thinking about your opponent's perspective allows you to be more aware of enemy positions, and it also prepares you to utilize the T rule. In case you haven't heard of that before, the T rule is a neat visualization tool introduced by a good friend of mine, Royal G. He recently joined our coaching team, so he's going to be teaching a few lessons inside our program as well. He talked about it in depth in this video, which you'll find linked below. But the idea is actually quite simple. Imagine the line of sight of your enemy as the letter T. And the top of the letter T is the ideal pathing you would want to take in order to maximize the speed of your peek. This works because your movement is exactly perpendicular to your enemy's line of sight. If you know the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the length of the hypotenuse is always longer than the sides. This means if you add in any vertical movement from the enemy's line of sight, you're going to always be moving less in the x-axis or like left and right on the enemy's screen compared to just moving in the x-axis. Therefore, if you peek diagonally into the enemy's line of sight, you'll appear to be moving slower left or right versus peeking completely perpendicularly. And one final tip for the T rule, if you're hitting someone with a wide or standard peek using the T rule, your goal is to kill the guy on the other side. So don't second guess yourself. If you're unsure if you want to peek the enemy, then it's probably best you don't. Instead, go for an information peek or use an ability instead. Okay. Now that you're locked in and ready to go, it's time to move on to step 3, which is to execute. From your preparation, you already know what angle you're peeking, how it looks from the point of view of your opponents, and what the best peek for the situation is. Now it's time to take that preparation and execute your peek. The most important thing about executing a good peek is that you do it with confidence. The way you achieve that is actually quite simple. Since you've already done all the preparation, you now only have to get mentally prepared to shoot and just go for it. Because you're well prepared and have visualized your opponent, you'll notice your reaction times are quicker, and if your preparation was good, you just bagged a kill. Now that you're familiar with the steps, let's look at an example of how I pulled off a 1v4 clutch using the Ape method. Starting off the clip, you see me and my teammates running into hookah after we rotated from A through the teleporter. Unfortunately, my 2 teammates die as soon as they jump out of hookah, and since I'm also stunned, I decide to take a step back and hold CT for a swing. Deadlock peeks me, I somehow get the kill, and I use a heal right away, and as soon as I activate it, I hear Clove running towards me. Here, I assess that they're probably greedy for a trade, so I quickly take a step back and prepare for a wide swing. I get the kill, jump out to sight, and as soon as I land, Clove activates their ult. I quickly assess that this likely means an enemy will be swinging from spawn since they probably don't want me to kill Clove for free. So I prepare to peek the angle and execute it right away. Unfortunately, Sky peeks right after I do, so I'm not able to land the shots. I quickly reposition myself to fight Clove again without being exposed to CT. Now, I'm not really sure where the Jet is yet, but I assess either Sky or Jet could be playing in CT, trying to come out and trade the Clove. It's possible they can be together, so I prepare to jiggle peek CT again without the intention of committing to a spray this time because that would make it easier for Jet to trade me. And sure enough, as I execute the peek, she's there and it turns into a 1v1. At this point, I assess it's quite likely for Sky to try and walk out. So I tap the spike and prepare to peek her from an unexpected angle. As I execute my peek, I notice she's actually out already, and luckily my angle was indeed unexpected, and I get a free kill nevertheless to round off the clutch. Of course, in this situation, things all happened quite fast, but don't worry. In most situations, you have a lot more time, and as you get better at using the Ape method, you'll notice it'll become second nature to you, and you can do it without much thinking. All right. Now that you know the basics of the Ape method, let's go over its more advanced uses. For the first step, I told you to assess whether the angle you're about to peek is a common angle, off angle, or a roulette angle, because this will determine what peek you're going to use. But if you truly want to master your peeks, you have to be able to assess the different types of advantages you have to prepare and execute your peeks. Different types of advantages can make or break your duel, and there are quite a few of them you can utilize. So let's go into each of them. The first is regular angle advantages. If you're playing hide and seek with 5-year-olds, the technique, if I don't see you, you don't see me, is quite valid. But in Valorant, it's not. And if you're standing closer to an object compared to your enemy, they'll be able to see you first. So for example, playing off angles that are combined with an angle advantage is really strong because you'll see an enemy that doesn't see you on their screen while they're trying to slice the pie. But in reality, angle advantages aren't the end-all be-all of winning or losing gunfights. In fact, there are even cases where giving yourself an angle disadvantage actually works in your favor. For example, if an enemy is close around the corner, you can hit them with a nasty wide peek. Maybe even with something like a Spectre. And also, if you want to maximize your angle advantage, remember that first and foremost, you should respect the T-roll, since if you bump into walls or objects in an attempt to optimize your angle advantage, your peek actually turns out much worse than if you had just taken a few steps forward. The second advantage you need to learn to assess for your peeks is gun advantages. The type of weapon your enemy has makes a massive difference in how you peek the angle, especially when considering the distance of your gunfight. We mentioned it at the start of the video, but if you're peeking an op at extreme distances, chances are your disadvantage is so large, there's no way to overcome it. So your best bet is to first bait out a shot with a jiggle peek or preferably jump peek before you go for a wide swing to punish the missed shot. But there are also cases where you're peeking someone with a judge, where you actually want to keep your distance. So to counter a judge, you can fake getting closer to the angle with footsteps, only to take a step back as you wait for the judge to come jumping around the corner. Similarly, it's good to be a bit careful when dealing with someone with a sheriff. If you hit them with a standard peek, you're giving them the ideal fight they want to get a quick one tap on you. Whereas if you first jiggle them to be a bit annoying and mess up their first bullet accuracy, you can then wide swing them, which gives your opponent a much tougher shot to hit. Of course, every gunfight is going to be a bit different depending on the distance and the weapons of both players. But if you factor this into the Ape method, you'll win a lot more of your gunfights. The third advantage you need to learn is info advantages, which as the name implies means that depending on how much info you have or don't have, the way you peek and take gunfights will look different. The more info you have on the enemy, the more you can confidently peek and take the fight. But if you have less info on the enemy, you want to resort to using safer peeks like jiggle peeks, jump peeks, and slicing the pie. For example, if your enemy is getting scanned by a dart, you'll know exactly where to pre-aim when you peek and take the fight. But if you're less sure about an enemy's position, you should try to jiggle for info and incorporate pre-firing angles. Now, info advantages on their own are really nice, but they become really powerful when you also have this fourth advantage, which is a timing advantage. A timing advantage is when you catch an enemy while they're busy with something else. Maybe you peek them as they start a reload, maybe they're more focused on trying to shoot a skydog or boombot, or maybe you force them to move because you used a damaging ability like a molly or nade, though their gun is going to be less accurate. If you can get a timing and seize the moment, you can easily get a kill. And if you're lucky, it even comes with a nice chat message. And finally, you have ability advantages. These advantages are nice to have, but the level of advantage you get varies widely. It ranges from someone literally being detained or stuck in a deadlock ult, or even someone who's just breach stunned, which is almost a buff at this point because you best believe they're going to be one-tapping you. Gaining ability advantages is a large part of what Valorant is all about. And if you're a good player, you'll utilize your abilities in creative ways that create info and timing advantages. And that should be all for this video. If you'd like to learn more about the Ape method, check out this other video I made. Link will be available in the comments below. And if you'd like to know a bit more about the T-roll, Roll's video will be available right there as well. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.